Marcus Thompson walked into the courthouse at exactly 8:30 in the morning, just like he had done every day for the past 3 weeks. He carried a small brown leather briefcase and wore a plain dark blue suit that made him blend in with all the other people in the building. Nobody paid attention to him as he walked down the long hallway with its shiny marble floors and tall windows. The security guard at the metal detector barely looked up as Marcus placed his briefcase on the conveyor belt. He had seen Marcus so many times that he just waved him through without asking any questions. Marcus nodded politely and collected his briefcase on the other side. He moved like someone who belonged there, someone who had important business to attend to. Judge Patricia Whitman's courtroom was on the 3rd floor. Marcus took the elevator up and walked down another long hallway lined with wooden benches. People sat on these benches waiting for their cases to be called. Some looked nervous, others looked bored, and a few looked scared. Marcus had seen all these expressions before during his 3 weeks of coming here. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors to courtroom 3B and stepped inside. The room was bigger than most people expected, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches for people to sit on. At the front of the room was the judge's bench, raised up high so everyone had to look up at whoever was sitting there. The American flag stood in one corner, and the state flag stood in the other. Marcus walked to the back row and sat down in the same seat he had chosen on his first day. It was the perfect spot for watching everything that happened in the courtroom. From there, he could see the judge's face clearly, watch how she moved her hands when she talked, and observe how she looked at different people who came before her. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small leather notebook and a black pen. The notebook looked old and well used, with pages that were already filled with his careful handwriting. Marcus turned to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then he wrote the time, 8:55 a.m. The bailiff, a tall man with gray hair named Officer Rodriguez, unlocked the door that led to the judge's chambers. Marcus had learned the bailiff's name by listening carefully over the past few weeks. He had learned many things by listening and watching. Other people began filing into the courtroom. There were lawyers carrying thick folders and briefcases, family members who had come to support someone, and defendants who would soon stand before the judge. Marcus watched them all, but he was most interested in watching Judge Whitman when she came out. At exactly 9 o'clock, Officer Rodriguez stood up and called out in a loud voice, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Patricia Whitman presiding. Everyone in the courtroom stood up as the judge walked out from her chambers. Judge Whitman was a woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore the traditional black robe that all judges wore, and she carried herself like someone who was used to being in charge. She sat down in her big leather chair and looked out over the courtroom. Marcus studied her face as she settled into her seat. He noticed how her eyes moved across the room, how she arranged the papers on her desk, and how she held her hands. These were all details that most people would never think to notice, but Marcus had been trained to see everything. The judge picked up her gavel and tapped it once on the wooden block beside her. "Court is now in session," she announced. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily to every corner of the room. Marcus began writing in his notebook. He wrote down the time court started, how the judge looked, and what she said. But more importantly, he began writing down things that other people missed. He noticed that when the judge looked at the defendant's waiting area, her expression changed slightly. Her eyes became harder, more judgmental. The first case was called, and a young man walked up to stand before the judge. Marcus watched carefully and continued writing. He was building a picture, piece by piece, day by day. And today, just like every other day, he would document everything he saw. Marcus had been watching Judge Whitman for 3 weeks now, and he was beginning to see things that made his stomach turn. Every day brought new examples of behavior that most people in the courtroom missed, but Marcus caught everything. His training had taught him to look for patterns, and the patterns he was seeing were deeply troubling. On his first day in the courtroom, Marcus had noticed something odd about how Judge Whitman spoke to different people. When a well-dressed white lawyer approached her bench, She smiled slightly and spoke in a calm, measured tone. But when a young black man in an orange jumpsuit was brought before her, her voice became sharp and cold. At first, Marcus thought it might just be coincidence. By the end of his first week, Marcus knew it was not coincidence at all. He had filled page after page in his notebook with detailed observations. He wrote down exact quotes of what the judge said to different defendants. He recorded the tone of her voice, the expressions on her face, and the sentences she handed down. The patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. When 22-year-old Deshaun Williams appeared before Judge Whitman for a minor drug possession charge, she barely let him speak. She interrupted him 3 times while he tried to explain his situation. Her voice was harsh as she told him that people like him needed to learn responsibility. She sentenced him to 6 months in jail and 2 years probation. Just 2 hours later, 23-year-old Brad Patterson appeared before the same judge for the exact same charge. He was white, wore a nice suit, and had his parents sitting in the front row. Judge Whitman listened patiently as he explained that he had made a mistake and was ready to turn his life around. She gave him community service and drug counseling, with no jail time at all. Marcus wrote down every detail of both cases. He noted that both young men were close in age, both had no prior criminal record, and both had been caught with the same amount of the same drug. The only difference was the color of their skin and the clothes they wore. Judge Whitman had treated them like they were completely different types of people. This pattern repeated itself day after day. Marcus documented case after case where Judge Whitman showed clear bias in her treatment of defendants. African American defendants received harsher sentences, fewer opportunities to speak, and less patience from the judge. White defendants, especially those who looked wealthy or educated, received lighter sentences and more consideration. Marcus also noticed how Judge Whitman treated the lawyers differently. When public defenders, who usually represented poorer defendants, tried to argue for their clients, she often cut them off or dismissed their arguments quickly. But when expensive private lawyers spoke, she listened carefully and often agreed with their requests for reduced charges or lighter sentences. One particularly disturbing case involved 2 women who had both been caught shoplifting. The first woman, Maria Santos, was Hispanic and spoke English with an accent. When she tried to explain that she had been struggling to feed her children, Judge Whitman showed no sympathy. She lectured Maria about taking responsibility and sentenced her to 60 days in jail. The second woman, Jennifer Walsh, was white and spoke confidently about how this was completely out of character for her. Judge Whitman nodded understandingly and gave her only community service, saying that everyone deserves a second chance. Marcus had seen enough. His notebook was filled with evidence that Judge Whitman was not treating all defendants equally under the law. She was making decisions based on race, appearance, and social class rather than on the facts of each case. But Marcus needed more evidence before he could take action. He needed to document enough cases to show that this was not just a few isolated incidents, but a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. So he continued to sit in the back row, writing in his notebook, waiting for the right moment to reveal what he had discovered. Thursday morning started like any other day in Judge Whitman's courtroom, but Marcus could sense something different in the air. The judge seemed more irritated than usual, snapping at the court clerk over some missing paperwork and glaring at anyone who made even the smallest noise. Her mood was dark, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the tension. Marcus sat in his usual spot in the back row, his leather notebook open on his lap. He had been documenting everything as always, writing down the judge's words and actions with careful precision. Today he was particularly focused because he had noticed that the judge was being even harsher than normal with the defendants who appeared before her. The morning had already brought 3 cases where Judge Whitman had shown clear bias. She had given a young black woman 30 days in jail for missing a court date, while giving a white man only a warning for the same violation just an hour later. Marcus wrote down every detail, including the exact words the judge used and the tone of her voice. As the morning progressed, Marcus noticed that Judge Whitman kept glancing back at him. At first, He thought she was just looking around the courtroom as judges often did, but her eyes kept returning to him, and her expression grew more annoyed each time she looked his way. During a brief recess between cases, the courtroom was quiet except for the shuffling of papers and whispered conversations between lawyers and their clients. Marcus continued writing in his notebook, reviewing his notes from the morning and adding additional observations about the judge's behavior patterns. Suddenly, Judge Whitman's voice cut through the quiet courtroom like a knife. "You there, in the back row." She was pointing directly at Marcus, her face flushed with anger. "What exactly are you writing about in that little book of yours?" Every person in the courtroom turned to look at Marcus. Lawyers stopped their conversations, defendants looked over their shoulders, and the court reporter paused with her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus looked up calmly from his notebook. He had been expecting this moment for days, knowing that eventually his constant note-taking would attract the judge's attention. He was prepared for this confrontation, though he had hoped it would happen under different circumstances. "I am observing the court proceedings, Your Honor," Marcus replied in a steady, respectful voice. His tone was calm and professional, showing no sign of intimidation or fear despite the judge's obvious anger. Judge Whitman's face grew even redder. "Observing what exactly?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the courtroom. "Are you some kind of reporter or something? You cannot just sit in my courtroom day after day, scribbling notes about things that are none of your business." Marcus remained perfectly calm, his hands folded over his notebook. "Your Honor, these are public proceedings, and I have every right to observe and take notes." His voice was quiet but firm, and his respectful tone made it clear that he understood courtroom protocol even as he stood his ground. The judge's anger seemed to intensify with his calm response. She was not used to being questioned or challenged in any way, and Marcus' steady demeanor only made her more furious. She had ruled her courtroom with an iron fist for 15 years, and she expected everyone who entered to show her complete deference and submission. "Well, I do not like it," Judge Whitman snapped, her professional composure beginning to crack. "I have been watching you sit back there for weeks, always writing, always watching. It makes me uncomfortable, and I want to know what you think you are doing." The entire courtroom was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone could sense that this was more than just a simple question about note-taking. There was something deeper happening, something that was about to change everything. Judge Whitman's face had turned a deep shade of red, and her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of her bench. Marcus could see that she was losing control of her emotions, something that should never happen to a judge in a courtroom. He continued to sit calmly, his notebook still open on his lap, watching her with the same steady gaze he had maintained for 3 weeks. "I asked you a question," the judge said, her voice rising to a level that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. "What are you writing about in that notebook? And why have you been coming to my courtroom every single day for weeks?" Marcus looked directly at her, his expression remaining calm and respectful. "Your Honor, I am simply exercising my right as a citizen to observe public court proceedings. My notes are my own business, and I am not disrupting the court in any way." This answer made Judge Whitman even angrier. She stood up from her chair, something judges rarely did during proceedings, and leaned forward over her bench. Her voice became sharp and threatening as she spoke. "Do not take that tone with me, young man," she said, emphasizing the words in a way that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. "You may think you have rights, but in my courtroom, I decide what is appropriate behavior. And I am telling you that your constant note-taking and lurking in the back of my courtroom is not appropriate." Marcus remained seated and kept his voice level and respectful. "Your Honor, I am not lurking. I am sitting in a public area of a public courtroom, observing public proceedings. I have done nothing wrong, and I have not disrupted the court in any way." The judge's anger was now clearly visible to everyone in the room. Her professional mask was slipping away, revealing something ugly underneath, Several of the lawyers in the courtroom exchanged worried glances, knowing that they were witnessing behavior that was completely inappropriate for a judge. "You know what I think?" Judge Whitman said, her voice now dripping with contempt. "I think you are probably looking for trouble. I think you are probably hoping to find something you can complain about or cause problems with. People like you always are." The words "people like you" hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in the courtroom knew exactly what she meant, and everyone knew that she had just crossed a line that should never be crossed. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, recording every terrible word. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, but his training had taught him to stay calm under pressure. He knew that losing his temper now would only make things worse. Instead, he continued to write in his notebook, documenting the judge's words and behavior with the same careful attention he had shown for weeks. "Stop writing," Judge Whitman shouted, pointing her finger at him like a weapon. "I am talking to you, and you will give me your full attention when I am speaking to you." Marcus looked up at her again, his pen still in his hand. "Your Honor, I am giving you my full attention. I am also taking notes, which is my right." "Your right," the judge repeated mockingly. "Let me tell you something about your rights. Your rights do not include disrupting my courtroom or making me uncomfortable with your suspicious behavior. Your rights do not include sitting in my courtroom day after day, watching my every move like some kind of spy." The word spy seemed to trigger something even darker in the judge's mind. Her next words came out in a rush of anger and prejudice that shocked everyone who heard them. "I know exactly what you are doing," she said, her voice now filled with venom. "You are probably working with some troublemaker lawyer or activist group, looking for any excuse to file complaints or lawsuits. Well, I have news for you. I have been a judge for 15 years, and I will not be intimidated by people like you who think they can come into my courtroom and cause trouble." Marcus continued writing, his hand moving steadily across the page. Every word the judge spoke was being documented, every display of bias and prejudice carefully recorded. He knew that this moment would be crucial evidence in his investigation, though Judge Whitman had no idea what she was revealing about herself. The entire courtroom was now watching this confrontation with a mixture of shock and fascination. Everyone could see that something terrible was happening, but no one knew how to stop it. Judge Whitman had completely lost control of herself now, and her words were becoming more dangerous with each passing moment. The professional facade that she had maintained for 15 years on the bench was crumbling before everyone's eyes, revealing the ugly prejudices that had been hidden underneath. "You think you are so smart, sitting back there with your little notebook," she continued, her voice filled with rage. "But I can see right through you. I know exactly what kind of person you are, and I know what you are trying to do here." Marcus continued to write, his pen moving steadily across the page as he documented every word. His calm response to her anger only seemed to make her more furious, and she began to say things that would have ended any judge's career if they had been said in a normal situation. "People like you always think you can come into places where you do not belong and cause trouble," Judge Whitman said, emphasizing the words "people like you" in a way that made her meaning crystal clear to everyone in the courtroom. "You think you can sit there and judge me, but you are the one who does not belong here." The court reporter's fingers were flying across her keyboard now, recording every terrible word that came out of the judge's mouth. Several lawyers in the courtroom were quietly taking their own notes, knowing that they were witnessing something that would make legal history. "I have been watching you for weeks, and I know what you are up to," the judge continued. "You are probably planning to make up some story about how unfairly I treat people, or maybe you are working with criminals to help them get out of the punishment they deserve." Marcus looked up at her calmly and spoke in his quiet, respectful voice. "Your Honor, I am simply observing court proceedings. I am not working with anyone, and I am not planning anything except taking notes about what I see and hear." "Do not lie to me," Judge Whitman screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of the courtroom. "I can tell just by looking at you what kind of person you are. You probably have a criminal record yourself. You probably think that the law does not apply to you. Every person in the courtroom was now staring at this unprecedented display of judicial misconduct. Defendants who were waiting for their cases to be called sat with their mouths open in shock. Lawyers who had practiced in this courtroom for years had never seen anything like what was happening. I think you might even be dangerous, the judge continued, her paranoia now completely taking over her judgment. Sitting back there day after day, watching, planning, writing everything down. That is not normal behavior. That is the behavior of someone who is planning to cause trouble or hurt someone. Marcus remained perfectly calm, but inside he was amazed at how completely Judge Whitman was destroying her own career with her words. Every sentence that came out of her mouth was more evidence of the bias and prejudice that he had come to investigate. I want you removed from my courtroom right now, Judge Whitman demanded, pointing at Marcus with a shaking finger. Officer Rodriguez, escort this man out of here immediately, and I want him banned from coming back. He is clearly up to no good. Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff, looked uncomfortable and confused. He had seen Marcus in the courtroom for weeks and had never observed any inappropriate behavior. Marcus had always been quiet, respectful, and had never caused any problems whatsoever. Your Honor, Officer Rodriguez said hesitantly, this gentleman has not violated any courtroom rules. He has been very respectful and has not caused any disturbances. This response made Judge Whitman even angrier. Are you questioning my judgment? Officer Rodriguez, she snapped. I am telling you that this man is suspicious and potentially dangerous, and I want him removed from my courtroom immediately. Marcus slowly closed his notebook and placed it in his briefcase. He knew that this confrontation had gone far enough, and it was time to reveal who he really was. He had more than enough evidence now to complete his investigation, and Judge Whitman had just provided him with the most damaging evidence of all. He stood up slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Every eye in the courtroom was focused on him as he reached into his jacket pocket. Judge Whitman's eyes grew wide with alarm, and she shouted for security again, convinced that he was reaching for a weapon. But Marcus was not reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for something that would change everything that was about to happen in that courtroom. Marcus pulled out a black leather credential case from his jacket pocket and held it up so everyone in the courtroom could see it clearly. The gold badge inside caught the light from the overhead fluorescent bulbs, and suddenly the entire atmosphere in the room changed completely. Your Honor, Marcus said in his calm, steady voice that had not changed despite everything Judge Whitman had just said to him. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am a federal judicial investigator with the Central Intelligence Agency. The silence that followed his words was so complete that it seemed like the entire world had stopped breathing. Judge Whitman's face went from angry red to pale white in a matter of seconds. Her mouth fell open, and she gripped the edge of her bench so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For the past 3 weeks, Marcus continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the now silent courtroom, I have been conducting an official investigation into reported patterns of judicial bias and misconduct in this courtroom. Everything that has happened here today, including your statements to me, has been documented as part of this federal investigation. The lawyers in the courtroom began whispering urgently to each other. Some pulled out their cell phones to make calls, while others frantically took notes about what they had just witnessed. The defendants waiting for their cases sat frozen in their seats, hardly believing what they were hearing. Judge Whitman tried to speak, but no words came out of her mouth. She looked like someone who had just seen a ghost, and in a way she had. The quiet black man she had been attacking and insulting for the past hour was actually a federal investigator who had been sent specifically to investigate her. Marcus opened his credential case wider and showed his official identification to Officer Rodriguez, who examined it carefully and nodded to confirm its authenticity. The bailiff's expression showed that he understood the gravity of what had just happened in the courtroom. I have been trained by the CIA in surveillance techniques and judicial oversight procedures, Marcus explained to the stunned courtroom. I was assigned to this case after multiple formal complaints were filed with the federal judiciary about potential bias and discriminatory practices in this courtroom. Judge Whitman finally found her voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. I did not know. I thought you were. Marcus looked directly at her, his expression still calm, but now carrying the weight of federal authority. Your Honor, during my 3 weeks of observation, I have documented numerous instances of what appears to be discriminatory treatment of defendants based on race, economic status, and other factors. Today's incident will be included in my official report to the federal judiciary. The judge's career was flashing before her eyes. 15 years on the bench, a respected position in the legal community, her reputation among her peers. All of it was crumbling around her because of the words she had just spoken and the behavior she had just displayed. The court reporter continued typing furiously, knowing that every word of this conversation would be scrutinized by federal officials and possibly used in legal proceedings. The transcript of this day would become one of the most important documents in the history of judicial oversight. Marcus closed his credential case and put it back in his jacket pocket. He picked up his briefcase and walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Every person in the room watched him move, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would change everything. Your Honor, Marcus said as he approached the bench, I want to make it clear that my investigation was not based on any personal animosity or desire to cause problems. I was simply doing my job, which is to ensure that all citizens receive fair and equal treatment under the law. Judge Whitman's hands were shaking as she tried to compose herself. She realized that not only had she been caught showing bias in her regular court proceedings, but she had also just demonstrated that same bias in the most dramatic way possible in front of a federal investigator who had been specifically sent to look for exactly that kind of behavior. Marcus turned to address the entire courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to today's proceedings. This investigation has been conducted in accordance with federal law and proper oversight procedures. Court will likely need to be adjourned while this matter is addressed through proper channels. The impact of Marcus's revelation was spreading through the courtroom like ripples on a pond. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would have consequences far beyond this single day, far beyond this single courtroom, and far beyond the career of one biased judge. Marcus stood at the front of the courtroom, his federal credentials still visible to everyone present. The shock of his revelation was beginning to sink in, and people were starting to understand the full magnitude of what had just happened. Judge Whitman remained frozen in her chair, her face pale and her hands trembling. Before I was assigned to this case, Marcus began, speaking clearly so everyone could hear him. I completed specialized training at the CIA facility in Langley, Virginia. This training included advanced surveillance techniques, behavioral analysis, and judicial oversight procedures. I was specifically prepared to investigate allegations of bias and misconduct in federal and state court systems. The lawyers in the courtroom were frantically taking notes, knowing that they were hearing information that would be crucial for their own cases and for the legal community as a whole. Some of them had clients who had appeared before Judge Whitman and received what they thought were unfairly harsh sentences. My assignment to this courthouse came after the Department of Justice received multiple complaints about discriminatory practices in this courtroom. Marcus continued. Citizens, lawyers, and even some court employees had filed formal reports alleging that defendants were being treated differently based on their race, ethnicity, and economic status. Judge Whitman tried to interrupt. Mr. Thompson, I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding. I have always tried to be fair and impartial in my courtroom. Marcus looked at her with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Your Honor, I have documented evidence that suggests otherwise. Over the past 3 weeks, I have recorded detailed observations of court proceedings, including exact quotes, sentencing patterns, and behavioral analysis. He opened his briefcase and pulled out his leather notebook, which was now filled with pages of careful handwriting. This notebook contains documentation of 37 separate cases where defendants facing similar charges receive significantly different treatment based on apparent demographic factors. The number 37 hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Everyone realized that this was not just a few isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior that had been going on for a long time and affecting many people. For example, Marcus said, turning to a specific page in his notebook, on May 15th, 2 defendants appeared before this court for identical drug possession charges. Both were first-time offenders with no prior criminal record. The African-American defendant received 6 months in jail and 2 years probation. The white defendant received community service and drug counseling with no jail time. Judge Whitman's face grew even paler as Marcus read from his notes. She remembered both cases clearly now, and she knew that everything he was saying was absolutely true and could be verified from the court records. Marcus continued reading examples from his notebook, each one more damaging than the last. He had documented cases involving sentencing disparities, different levels of patience shown to defendants, interruptions during testimony, and variations in the judge's tone of voice and body language. But the most significant evidence, Marcus said, closing his notebook and looking directly at Judge Whitman, occurred here today when Your Honor made statements that clearly demonstrated bias and prejudice toward me based on my race and your assumptions about my character and intentions. Officer Rodriguez stood near the judge's bench, looking uncomfortable but understanding his duty to maintain order in the courtroom. The bailiff had worked with Judge Whitman for several years, but he had never seen her behave the way she had today. Your Honor, Marcus said, addressing the judge directly, my investigation will include not only the patterns of behavior I observed over 3 weeks, but also the verbal statements you made during today's confrontation. All of this information will be included in my report to the Federal Judiciary Oversight Committee. Judge Whitman finally found her voice, though it came out weak and shaky. Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize for my behavior today. I was frustrated, and I said things that I should not have said. This is not representative of how I normally conduct my courtroom. Marcus nodded respectfully but continued with his explanation. Your Honor, apologies are appreciated, but they do not change the fact that this investigation has revealed a pattern of behavior that raises serious questions about equal treatment under the law. The courtroom remained silent as everyone absorbed the full impact of what had been revealed. People began to understand that they had witnessed not just an argument between a judge and a citizen, but the exposure of a federal investigation that had been going on secretly for weeks. Marcus closed his briefcase and prepared to leave the courtroom. His work here was essentially complete. He had gathered more evidence than he had expected, and Judge Whitman's behavior today had provided him with the most damaging evidence of all. The news of what happened in Judge Whitman's courtroom spread through the legal community faster than wildfire. Within 2 hours of Marcus revealing his identity, lawyers throughout the city were calling each other to share the incredible story of the federal investigator who had been quietly documenting judicial bias for 3 weeks. Sarah Martinez, a public defender who had been in the courtroom that morning, immediately called her supervisor. You are not going to believe what just happened in Whitman's courtroom, she said, her voice still shaking from what she had witnessed. A CIA investigator has been sitting in the back row for weeks, documenting everything, and today the judge completely lost it and showed her true colors. By noon, the story had reached the offices of the State Bar Association, the Judicial Review Board, and several civil rights organizations. Phone calls were being made, meetings were being scheduled, and formal complaints were being prepared based on what multiple witnesses had seen and heard. Marcus returned to his hotel room and immediately began preparing his official report. He had pages of detailed notes to transcribe, and he wanted to include every significant detail while the events were still fresh in his memory. His laptop screen glowed as he typed his observations into the official federal investigation format. The most damaging evidence against Judge Whitman came from her own words during the confrontation. Marcus had recorded her exact statements in his notebook, and he knew that the court reporter had also captured everything on her official transcript. There would be no way for the judge to deny what she had said or claim that her words had been taken out of context. Judge Whitman remained in her chambers for the rest of the day, unable to face returning to the courtroom. She knew that her career was over, but she was still trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. She called her lawyer and tried to explain what had happened, but even she could hear how terrible her actions sounded when she tried to describe them. Meanwhile, lawyers who had practiced before Judge Whitman for years began reviewing their old cases with new eyes. They remembered incidents that they had dismissed at the time, but now seemed to fit a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Some began contacting former clients who might have grounds for appeals based on the evidence of judicial bias. The court reporter's transcript of the day's events became the most requested document in the courthouse. Legal secretaries were making copies for lawyers who wanted to study exactly what had been said and how it had been said. Every word of Judge Whitman's tirade was now preserved in official court records. By evening, the local news stations had gotten word of the story. Reporters were calling the courthouse, trying to get official statements about the federal investigation and the dramatic confrontation that had taken place. The story was too big and too unusual to ignore. Marcus received a call from his supervisor at the CIA Judicial Oversight Division. The conversation was brief but significant. His investigation had uncovered exactly the kind of systematic bias that the federal government was working to eliminate from the court system. Over the next few days, more information began to surface about Judge Whitman's history on the bench. Court employees who had been afraid to speak up before now felt safe to share their observations about patterns of unfair treatment. Defense attorneys began coming forward with stories about cases where they felt their clients had been treated unfairly. The State Judicial Review Board announced that they would be conducting their own investigation based on Marcus' findings. They requested copies of all his documentation and began reviewing court transcripts from Judge Whitman's cases over the past several years. Civil rights organizations that had received complaints about Judge Whitman in the past now had the evidence they needed to take formal action. The complaints that had seemed isolated before now appeared to be part of a larger pattern of discrimination. Marcus knew that his work in this courthouse was finished, but the impact of his investigation was just beginning.